Every child deserves a parent, but not every parent deserves a child. It's a line that feels almost philosophical at first, something you might reflect on and move past. But in this case, it becomes something far more unsettling. Because at the center of the story is a man who called himself a father, not once or twice, but 17 times over. 17 children. A number that, on its surface, suggests experience, responsibility, even devotion. But when you look closer, something doesn't quite align. Because behind that number, behind the image of a large family, there are questions, quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. 6 of those children would lose their lives in a fire. A fire that, in the beginning, looked like nothing more than a heartbreaking accident. The kind of tragedy that communities rally around. The kind that draws sympathy, support, and an outpouring of grief. A home reduced to ashes, lives cut short, a family torn apart in a matter of minutes. It's the kind of story we've seen before, devastating, but explainable. Fires happen. Faulty wiring, an unattended flame, a moment of bad luck. Sometimes, there is no deeper reason, just loss. But in this case, something felt off. At first, it was subtle, the kind of detail you might not notice unless you were paying very close attention. The way the father spoke, the way he carried himself in the days that followed. Grief has many forms, of course. There's no single way to mourn. Some people collapse under the weight of it. Others become quiet, distant, almost numb. But this was different. Not louder, not more dramatic. Just different in a way that was hard to define, but impossible to shake. Those closest to the situation began to notice it first. A lack of urgency in certain moments. An unusual focus on things that didn't seem to match the gravity of what had just happened. Small inconsistencies, nothing definitive on their own, but enough to raise a question. And once that question is there, it has a way of growing. Because when something doesn't feel right, people start looking closer. They start connecting dots that may not have meant anything before. And what they began to see painted a far more complicated picture. This was not just a man grieving an unimaginable loss. This was someone who, by many accounts, had always been driven by something else: money, control, attention. Traits that, on their own, don't make someone dangerous. But in the context of what had just happened, they began to take on a different meaning, a more troubling one. Because when you start to examine the life behind the tragedy, patterns begin to emerge. A need to be seen, a need to be in control of the narrative. Decisions that, in hindsight, seem questionable at best. And suddenly, the fire is no longer just a fire. It becomes a focal point, something to be examined, re-examined, and questioned from every angle. Was it truly accidental? Or was there something more behind it? That's the question that begins to settle in, quietly at first, then with increasing weight. Because if this wasn't just a tragic mistake, if there was intent, or even recklessness, then everything changes. The story shifts from one of loss to one of responsibility. And possibly something even darker. What makes this case so deeply unsettling is not just the loss of 6 young lives. It's the uncertainty that surrounds it. The idea that something so devastating could be misunderstood at first glance. That what appears to be a random, heartbreaking accident might, in reality, be something far more deliberate, or, at the very least, something that spiraled far beyond anyone's control. And at the center of it all is that father. A man who should have been the protector. The one constant in his children's lives. The person they relied on for safety, for care, for love. And yet, as the questions begin to mount, that role becomes harder and harder to reconcile with what actually happened. Was he simply a grieving parent caught in an unthinkable situation? Or was he something else entirely? A man whose decisions, motivations, and actions played a far greater role than anyone initially realized? Because sometimes, the most disturbing truths are not the ones that are immediately visible. They're the ones that reveal themselves slowly, one detail at a time. Mick Philpott's story begins in 1956, in Derby, a place that, like many others in post-war Britain, was built on working-class stability and routine. But from early on, there were signs that his life would not follow a steady or predictable path. Those who encountered him often described a certain charm at first, an ability to present himself in a way that was engaging, even persuasive. But that surface didn't last. Over time, a pattern began to emerge. Charm would give way to control, and control, eventually, to violence. It wasn't random. It was targeted. Philpott gravitated toward vulnerable young women, often teenagers with difficult pasts, limited support systems, and few places to turn. In those early relationships, the imbalance of power was clear, though not always visible from the outside. One of his first known partners would later recount a relationship defined not by affection, but by fear. It escalated to the point where she was brutally attacked, stabbed in an act of violence that nearly cost her life. It was a moment that could have marked a turning point, a clear line between who he had been and who he might become. He was convicted and sent to prison. But even that didn't bring lasting change. He was released early for what was described as good behavior, a decision that, in hindsight, raises difficult questions. Because rather than stepping away from the patterns that had already caused so much harm, Philpott appeared to refine them. The violence didn't disappear. As the years went on, he built a life that, on the surface, looked unconventional but functional. He married, he had children, but stability was never truly part of the picture. Relationships overlapped. Affairs became routine. And gradually, something unusual took shape. Multiple partners living under one roof, bound not by mutual understanding, but by Philpott's influence. It wasn't a traditional household. It was something far more complex and far more fragile. By the time he settled into a small council house in Derby, the situation had reached a point that few could fully comprehend from the outside. 11 children lived in that home. 11 lives, all dependent on a structure that was already under strain. There was no steady employment anchoring the household. Instead, Philpott relied heavily on government benefits, which became the primary source of income. And that's where the dynamic becomes particularly troubling. Because over time, it began to appear that the children were not just part of the family, they were part of the system that sustained it. Each new child meant additional financial support, additional resources. It blurred the line between care and calculation in a way that would later become impossible to ignore. To outsiders, it raised uncomfortable questions about motivation, questions that Philpott himself seemed almost eager to confront. He didn't shy away from attention. In fact, he seemed to seek it out. He appeared on television, openly discussing his lifestyle, defending his choices, and challenging those who criticized him. To some, it came across as defiance. To others, it felt like something more deliberate and need to be seen, to control the narrative, to present himself as misunderstood rather than questioned. He argued with hosts, dismissed criticism, and leaned into the controversy surrounding his life, but what was happening behind closed doors told a different story. Inside that house, the atmosphere was far from the confident image he projected publicly. There were reports of control, strict rules, limited autonomy for the women living there, and an underlying tension that never fully surfaced but was always present. It wasn't constant chaos. In many ways, it was more subtle than that. A quiet pressure, a sense that everything revolved around one person's authority. And over time, that kind of environment begins to change people. It creates stress, resentment, and instability, conditions that don't always lead to immediate conflict, but that slowly build beneath the surface. By the early 2010s, the situation inside that home had become increasingly precarious. Relationships were strained. Financial pressures were constant. And the balance that had somehow been maintained for years was beginning to fracture. By 2012, it was no longer just an unconventional household. It was a volatile one. Everything that had been building over decades, the manipulation, the control, the reliance on a system that was never designed to support that kind of structure, was now reaching a critical point. From the outside, it might still have looked unusual, even controversial, but contained. Inside, however, the reality was far more unstable. And it was only a matter of time before something gave way. By the time the events of 2012 began to unfold, the pattern that had followed Philpott for decades was no longer subtle. It was deeply ingrained. His history was marked by repeated cycles of violence, manipulation, and intimidation, particularly toward the women in his life. These weren't isolated incidents or moments of lost temper. They were part of a broader system of control that shaped the environment inside his home. Physical abuse was one part of it, but just as damaging was the psychological pressure, constant, calculated, and often invisible to those on the outside. Control extended into every aspect of daily life. Finances were tightly managed, not for stability, but for dominance. The women living with him were often kept dependent, with limited access to resources or support systems beyond the household. Isolation played a key role. The fewer outside connections they had, the more influence he maintained. Over time, that kind of environment creates a reality where leaving doesn't just feel difficult, it feels almost impossible. But eventually one of them did leave. It wasn't sudden, and it wasn't easy. Breaking away from that level of control rarely is. But when she left, she didn't go alone. She took her children with her. And in doing so, she disrupted something that Philpott had carefully maintained for years. It wasn't just a personal loss. It was a loss of control, of structure, of the image he had built around himself. And that's where the shift begins. What followed was not reconciliation or reflection, but escalation. A bitter custody battle took shape, one that quickly revealed the deeper motivations at play. On the surface, it could be framed as a father wanting to be reunited with his children. But as the situation unfolded, that explanation began to feel incomplete. Because the focus didn't seem to rest on their well-being, it centered instead on what their presence represented: financial support through benefits, reinforcement of authority within the household, and the preservation of a public image he had worked hard to maintain. Losing them meant more than absence. It meant exposure. And in that space, between loss and the need to regain control, something far more dangerous began to take form. At some point, the idea emerged. Not impulsive, not emotional in the way one might expect, but deliberate. The plan, as investigators would later piece together, was as calculated as it was chilling. Set fire to the house. Create a scenario that could be blamed on the former partner. Then step into the role of the rescuer. The father who, in the face of disaster, risked everything to save his children. It would shift the narrative entirely. From scrutiny to sympathy. From suspicion to admiration. It was, in essence, a performance. And like any performance, it required preparation. Philpott did not act alone. He brought in an accomplice, a friend willing to assist in carrying out the plan. That detail alone adds another layer to the case, because it suggests discussion, agreement, and coordination. This was not a thought that passed through his mind and disappeared. It was something that was shared, developed, and ultimately set into motion. When investigators later examined the sequence of events, they found themselves asking a critical question, one that continues to define how this case is understood. This wasn't panic. There was no sudden trigger, no moment of overwhelming emotion that led to a reckless decision. Instead, what they saw were signs of planning, of intent, of a man who believed he could control not just the people around him, but the outcome of something far more dangerous. Fire, after all, is unpredictable. Once it begins, it doesn't follow instructions. It doesn't pause for second thoughts. And that's where the plan, however calculated it may have seemed, collided with reality. Because when control is built on manipulation, it can create the illusion that everything is manageable, that every variable can be accounted for. But some forces don't respond to control. They escalate. They spread. They take on a life of their own. And in this case, the consequences would move far beyond anything that could be staged, redirected, or undone. What was meant to be a controlled act, something designed to influence perception and outcome, was about to become something else entirely. Something irreversible. May 11th, 2012, just after 4 a.m. In the quiet early hours, when most of the neighborhood was still asleep, something began that would change everything. Petrol was poured through the letterbox of the house, a method as simple as it was devastating. Within moments, the fire took hold. Flames moved quickly, feeding on the structure, climbing faster than anyone inside could have anticipated. But here's where the plan, if it was ever truly a plan, began to unravel. Fire doesn't wait. It doesn't follow instructions or pause for timing. And almost immediately, it became clear that whatever control had been assumed was gone. The flames spread far more rapidly than expected, cutting off escape routes, filling the home with thick, suffocating smoke. There was no time to react, no moment to correct course. What was meant to be contained became uncontrollable in seconds. Upstairs, 6 children were trapped. They never made it out. The cause of death would later be confirmed as smoke inhalation, a silent, overwhelming force that gives little warning and even less time. There were no dramatic attempts at escape, no last-minute rescues. Just a growing darkness, room by room, until there was nothing left to be done. It happened quickly, but the consequences would last forever. When the fire was finally extinguished, the reality began to settle in. 6 young lives lost in what appeared, at first, to be a tragic accident. The community was devastated. Neighbors struggled to process what had happened, trying to reconcile the scale of the loss with the ordinary setting in which it occurred. It was the kind of event that brings people together in grief, questions set aside, replaced by sympathy and support. And initially there was a suspect. Attention turned toward the former partner, the one who had left, who had taken her children and disrupted the household. Given the ongoing custody dispute, it seemed, at least on the surface, like a possible motive. Emotions were already high, tensions well known. For a brief moment, the narrative seemed to align. But it didn't last. As investigators looked closer, the evidence simply didn't support that theory. She was quickly cleared, and with that, the focus had to shift. If it wasn't her, then who? And more importantly, why? That's when something else began to stand out. Mick Philpott's behavior. Grief, as we know, doesn't follow a script. People react differently, and there's no single way to mourn. But even with that understanding, his demeanor raised questions. He appeared on camera frequently, speaking to the media, engaging in interviews, but there was a disconnect. A tone that didn't quite match the situation. At times, he seemed unusually calm. At others, almost comfortable in the spotlight. There were moments that came across as inappropriate, comments that didn't align with the gravity of what had happened, even instances where he appeared to joke. Individually, these details might have been dismissed. But together, they created a pattern. And that pattern led investigators to take a closer look, not just at the fire, but at everything surrounding it. Forensic analysis became critical, and what it revealed began to shift the case in a very different direction. Traces of petrol were found on clothing, evidence that was difficult to explain away. It suggested proximity, involvement, something more than coincidence. And as the investigation deepened, more pieces began to fall into place. Then came the recordings, conversations captured quietly, that would later become central to the case. In them, there were references to sticking to the story, a phrase that carries weight when the truth is in question. There were inconsistencies, slips in language, moments where the narrative didn't hold. And gradually, what had once been presented as a unified account began to fracture. Within those recordings, there were admissions, not always direct, not always complete, but enough to suggest knowledge, involvement, and awareness. Enough to challenge the image that had been presented to the public. The grieving father. It's a powerful image. One that draws sympathy, that deflects suspicion. But as the evidence mounted, that image became harder to sustain. The calm demeanor, the media appearances, the inconsistencies, they were no longer just unusual. They were indicators. What had initially been seen as a devastating accident was now being re-examined through a very different lens. Because when you strip away the assumptions, when you follow the evidence instead of the narrative, a new picture begins to emerge. One that is far more deliberate, far more troubling. A sequence of actions that point not to tragedy alone, but to intention, however flawed, however disastrously executed. In the end, what investigators uncovered was not a random act of misfortune. It was a plan that failed. And in failing, it revealed everything. In the end, the truth that emerged was as disturbing as it was undeniable. What had once been framed as a tragic house fire, an accident that stole 6 young lives, was revealed to be something else entirely. The fire had been deliberately set, not in a moment of chaos or desperation, but as part of a plan. A plan rooted in control, image, and gain. The objective, as investigators and prosecutors outlined, was chilling in its simplicity. Set the fire. Blame the former partner. Recast the narrative. In the aftermath, appear as the desperate father, the one who tried to save his children, the one wronged by someone else's actions. In doing so, regain custody, restore public sympathy, and potentially secure financial advantage through benefits and support. But what makes this case so haunting is not just the plan, it's how completely it failed. Fire, once ignited, does not follow intention. It does not pause for timing or allow for second chances. And in this case, it moved faster than expected, with consequences that could not be contained or reversed. The very act meant to manipulate perception became the cause of irreversible loss. 6 children, who had no role in the conflict, no control over the situation, were caught in something they could not escape. When the case reached court, the legal outcome reflected a complex reality. While the fire was proven to be deliberate, prosecutors were unable to establish clear intent to kill. And that distinction mattered. The charges were reduced to manslaughter, acknowledging responsibility for the deaths, but stopping short of labeling it as intentional murder. Even so, the weight of accountability remained. Mick Philpott was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 15 years. It was a significant sentence, but for many, it didn't feel proportionate to the loss. His wife and the accomplice who helped carry out the plan received reduced sentences and were later released, having served their time. Legally, the case was resolved. But in the court of public opinion, it was far from settled. Outrage grew. For many, the idea that 6 children could die under such circumstances and that no one would be convicted of intending their deaths was difficult to accept. It raised uncomfortable questions about the limits of the legal system, about how intent is measured, and about whether justice, in cases like this, can ever truly feel complete. Beyond the legal outcome, experts began to examine the man at the center of it all. The labels that emerged were consistent: narcissistic, manipulative, displaying traits associated with psychopathy. These weren't casual descriptions. They were attempts to understand a pattern of behavior that had been visible for years. A pattern built on control, on the need to dominate relationships, on the ability to present one image publicly while maintaining another privately. And perhaps most disturbingly, on the way he appeared to view his own children. Not as individuals with their own lives, their own futures, but as extensions of a system, as leverage, as a means to maintain control, to secure income, to shape perception. It's a perspective that is difficult to fully comprehend and even harder to accept. But in the context of everything that had come before, the manipulation, the dependence, the calculated decisions, it becomes part of a larger, deeply troubling picture. 6 young lives were lost, not because of a random accident, not because of an unavoidable tragedy, but because of a chain of decisions driven by greed, control, and a belief that outcomes could be managed, even when dealing with something as destructive as fire. And that is where the story leaves us, with a question that doesn't have an easy answer. Could this have been prevented? The warning signs, in hindsight, seem clear. A history of violence, patterns of manipulation, a household defined by control and instability, public behavior that raised concerns even before the fire. But recognizing warning signs and acting on them are not always the same. Systems fail. People are overlooked. Situations that appear unusual, but not yet criminal, are allowed to continue until something happens that can no longer be ignored. And by then, it's often too late. This case doesn't just tell the story of what happened. It forces a reflection on everything that led up to it, on the moments where intervention might have been possible, on the lines that were crossed long before the fire was ever set. Because sometimes, the most important question isn't just how a tragedy occurred. It's whether it had to. Subscribe now because the next video is something most people aren't ready for.